She sat silently in the courtroom, her eyes fixed toward the ceiling as her lips moved in an almost invisible prayer. It was as if she believed that somewhere beyond those walls, someone, or something, could still save her. To the defense, Sofia Koval was not a murderer. She was a 14-year-old refugee whose childhood had been shattered by war. They described a girl who had fled the Russian invasion of Ukraine, endured constant air raid sirens, lost her home, and was separated from her mother. They argued that years of fear and trauma had finally overwhelmed a young mind that was never given the chance to heal. But prosecutors told a completely different story. Instead of beginning with sympathy, they showed photographs from the autopsy. They played recordings of Sofia's own statements. They reconstructed a timeline that revealed she had remained alone with her 80-year-old grandmother for nearly 4 hours after the attack. The image of a frightened child slowly gave way to something far more disturbing. Was this a broken teenager who finally snapped under unbearable emotional pressure? Or was this a young girl who understood exactly what she was doing? That question would dominate every moment of one of Florida's most unsettling juvenile murder cases. Just after midnight on May 23, 2024, Vladimir Koval returned to the apartment he shared with his mother and daughter in Lauderdale Lakes, Florida. He expected a quiet home after spending several hours visiting a friend. Instead, he walked into a nightmare that would destroy his family forever. His 80-year-old mother, Sofia Koval, was lying motionless on the living room floor. Blood surrounded her head. Pieces of her broken walker were scattered across the room. A leather belt rested nearby. Everything inside the apartment suggested a violent struggle had taken place. Sofia was still inside. Witnesses later described hearing strange noises coming from one of the bedrooms. Not screams, not desperate cries for help, just quiet, confused sounds that seemed disconnected from the horror unfolding only a few steps away. When Vladimir desperately asked what had happened, Sofia answered almost immediately, "Grandma attacked me. I defended myself." Those words became the foundation of her first explanation. If they were true, investigators would be looking at a tragic act of self-defense. If they were false, they would become the first of several stories that slowly collapsed. Paramedics rushed Sofia to the hospital, but she was pronounced dead shortly after arriving. Sofia was taken into emergency psychiatric evaluation before detectives officially began their investigation. Even during those first hours, officers noticed something they couldn't ignore. She did not cry. She did not ask whether her grandmother had survived. She appeared emotionally distant, almost detached from everything happening around her. For experienced investigators, that behavior immediately raised questions. The medical examiner's report quickly challenged Sofia's version of events. Sofya's injuries were not consistent with a brief struggle. They revealed a sustained and violent attack. Deep bruising covered both of her arms, indicating repeated attempts to shield herself. Those defensive wounds suggested she fought desperately to survive. Investigators identified 2 primary weapons. The first was a heavy leather belt with a large metal buckle. The second was Sofya's own walker, the device she depended on every day simply to move around her home. According to forensic evidence, the walker had been used as a blunt weapon before the belt was tightened around Sofya's neck. The marks left behind matched the belt recovered from the apartment. Together, the injuries painted a picture that prosecutors believed completely destroyed the claim of simple self-defense. Detectives then began reconstructing the hours leading up to the killing. Earlier that morning, Vladimir had confiscated Sofia's phone after weeks of arguments over her behavior. He later left the apartment around 8 o'clock that evening, believing his mother would be safe with his daughter for just a few hours. When he returned shortly after midnight, Sofia was dead. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing had been stolen. The apartment had remained locked. The timeline left investigators with only one person who could explain what had happened. And the more Sofia talked, the more her story began to change. Following the initial investigation, detectives continued examining both the physical evidence and Sofia Koval's statements. As interviews progressed, investigators noted that her explanation of the events changed over time. Her first account described the incident as self-defense. Later statements offered a different interpretation of what had happened. Prosecutors argued that these inconsistencies were significant because they believed they reflected an effort to explain the evidence rather than a consistent recollection of events. The defense, however, maintained that Sofia's changing statements should be viewed in the context of her age, emotional condition, and the psychological effects of trauma. To understand the circumstances surrounding the case, the court also examined the family's history. Sofia had been born in Ukraine in 2010. Her early childhood changed dramatically after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Like many families, the Kovals were forced to make difficult decisions for their safety. Sofia and her father eventually relocated to the United States, while her mother remained in Europe because she was unable to obtain a U.S. visa at that time. The separation meant that Sofia entered a new country without one of the people she had been closest to throughout her childhood. The family settled in Lauderdale Lakes, Florida, where Sofia lived with her father and her grandmother, Sofia Koval. Court testimony described Sofia as someone who had experienced major historical conflicts throughout her lifetime. She had survived the hardships of post-war Europe, later immigrated to the United States, and spent much of her life working and supporting her family. Witnesses described her as providing structure and supervision within the household, while Sofia's father worked long hours. Evidence presented in court also described the challenges Sofia faced after arriving in the United States. She was adapting to a new language, a different education system, and an unfamiliar culture. School records and testimony indicated that she had difficulty fitting in and struggled socially. The defense argued that these experiences, combined with separation from her mother and exposure to war, contributed to significant emotional distress. One issue repeatedly mentioned during testimony involved Sofia's mobile phone. According to witnesses, it served as one of her primary ways of communicating with her mother overseas. On the day of the incident, her father confiscated the phone, following ongoing disagreements about behavior and household responsibilities. Investigators established that this occurred before he left the apartment that evening. Although the prosecution did not argue that the phone alone caused the violence, it became an important part of the timeline considered during the proceedings. Using witness testimony, forensic findings, and the medical examiner's report, investigators reconstructed the sequence of events as accurately as possible. According to the prosecution's presentation, an argument occurred inside the apartment after Vladimir left. The evidence indicated that multiple objects were involved during the assault, including Sofya's walker and a leather belt later recovered from the scene. Medical findings documented blunt force injuries as well as injuries consistent with strangulation. The medical examiner concluded that the injuries reflected a sustained assault rather than a brief physical confrontation. Investigators also focused on the period between the assault and Vladimir's return shortly after midnight. Based on the evidence presented in court, no emergency call was made during that interval, and no request for outside assistance was documented. Prosecutors argued that this period was important because it demonstrated opportunities to seek medical help that were not taken. The defense did not dispute the timeline itself, but argued that Sofia's mental condition should be considered when evaluating her actions during those hours. When the case reached court, both sides relied heavily on expert testimony. Defense experts described the potential effects of trauma, displacement, and adolescent brain development. They argued that Sofia's experiences before arriving in the United States could not be separated from her behavior. Prosecutors presented testimony from an independent psychological evaluator who concluded that Sofia understood the nature and consequences of her actions. Ultimately, the court considered both perspectives before determining how the case would proceed within the juvenile justice system. The proceedings highlighted difficult questions about juvenile accountability, mental health, and rehabilitation. Rather than resolving every debate surrounding the case, the hearings demonstrated how the legal system weighs physical evidence, expert opinions, and personal history when deciding the appropriate legal outcome for a young defendant. As the hearings continued, the court considered two very different interpretations of the evidence. The defense argued that Sofia's actions could not be separated from her experiences as a child displaced by war. Their experts testified that prolonged trauma, family separation, and adolescent brain development could significantly affect judgment and emotional control. They believed the juvenile justice system offered the best opportunity for treatment and rehabilitation. The prosecution acknowledged Sofia's difficult background, but argued that the evidence showed she understood the nature of her actions. They relied on testimony from an independent psychologist who concluded that Sofia knew seriously harming another person was wrong and understood the likely consequences. Prosecutors also argued that her changing explanations during the investigation suggested an awareness of the seriousness of the incident rather than confusion alone. After reviewing testimony from investigators, forensic specialists, medical experts, and psychologists, the judge ruled that the case would proceed in juvenile court rather than adult court. Although this was viewed as a procedural victory for the defense, it did not remove Sofia's legal responsibility. Under the court's order, Sofia was committed to a maximum-risk juvenile program that included secure detention, mandatory psychological treatment, and ongoing supervision. Any future release would depend on professional evaluations, compliance with treatment, and continued approval by the juvenile justice system. The court also retained authority to review her progress if circumstances changed. During sentencing, Sofia's father addressed the court. Having lost his mother while watching his daughter enter the juvenile justice system, he expressed hope that the court's decision would help Sofia understand the consequences of her actions and eventually rebuild her life. According to the case record, Sofia remains under the supervision of Florida's juvenile justice system. The case continues to be discussed because it highlights the difficult balance between accountability, rehabilitation, and public safety when serious violent crimes involve juvenile defendants. Rather than providing simple answers, the proceedings illustrate how courts weigh evidence, expert testimony, and personal history before reaching a decision.